Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to week number three of PPA 500. Sounds strange to say we are at the halfway point of our class already, but this is week three out of six. These 6 week classes go by very quickly, and you'll get used to it. You'll get adjusted to it. Probably after you take a couple of these courses, you'll be used to it by then. Most people really like the 6 week courses. We cover the same material as we would have in a 15-week semester. But it just takes a little getting used to how quickly the pacing is for these courses. But we are in week number three, which means that Canvas essay number three is then due for next week. And in Canvas essay number three, we'll draw upon the material that we will cover tonight, looking at differences between public and private organizations. And we talk about the differences between public and private organizations as a prelude into our presentation of the study of public administration, where we talk about public administration, what it is, why we study it, and then have a discussion about whether or not public administration is a discipline or is it just a subfield in another academic discipline. So tonight, when we look at the public-private differences, that will then be our jumping off point for the discussion of public administration as a discipline. But since this is week number three, and we're essentially almost halfway through the course, it is important, I think, to remind you that you have a midterm assessment. And that midterm assessment is due in 2 weeks. And so I always like to walk you through the midterm assessment in class so we can all kind of get accustomed to how the assessments work, the types of scenarios there are on the assessments, and then most importantly, what my expectations are for you in doing a good job on the midterm assessment. So I've shared out on a screen with you the midterm assessment. Should become available on our Canvas site today. It is due in 2 weeks on February the 11th, I believe it is, if I have my dates correct. And as we talked about in our first class session together, we went over the syllabus. This is an assessment, it's not an examination. And I really take that difference seriously. As an assessment, I am looking for you to take the information that we cover in this class and then apply that information appropriately to the 5 scenarios that I provide for you here on this midterm assessment. So there's not rote memorization that is required here. You have 2 weeks to complete the midterm assessment. You are able to use all the information at your disposal, whether it be from our Wednesday evening sessions, whether it be from the readings that we do in the class. All that information is fair game that you can use in order to answer the questions related to these 5 scenarios. So it truly is an assessment of what you have learned up to this point in the course. If you would like to do outside research and include external citations, you are certainly free to do so, but that is not required because this is an assessment. So we're assessing what you have learned with the material that we have covered in the class. So again, on this assessment, which you have 2 weeks to work on, we have 5 scenarios. Each scenario is relatively brief, but it should be enough information to give you what you need in order to know how to apply the course material to address the scenarios. Now, I call them scenarios. Some of them are truly scenarios. Some are a little bit less in terms of being a scenario, but I just refer to them as scenarios for just ease of communication. So we have 5 scenarios, and then as you can see, there are 2 questions related to each one of those scenarios. So let me walk you through all 5 of the scenarios and all 10 of the questions, and kind of you can get an idea of what I am looking for. You know by now that I'm a big believer in parsimony. Be as concise as you can possibly be. Convey the information you need to convey using the fewest words possible because we are a public administration program after all. So what I'm looking for in terms of your responses here is probably about a paragraph per question would probably be enough to do the job. You certainly can go beyond that. If you need to use 2, 3, 4 paragraphs, whatever you need to use is fine. I won't stop reading after 1 paragraph per question, but usually about a paragraph is enough to kind of get the job done. So let's go through the midterm, and then I'll entertain whatever questions you have once we get through talking about the midterm, about how to do well on the midterm, or if something's unclear or ambiguous, I can clarify that for you. But in our first scenario, this is our foundational information that we talked about when we did our coverage of American government. So this is what we did a couple of weeks ago. As discussed in class, the Constitution received ratification from the requisite number of states relatively quickly. And we talked in class about how within about a year, we had enough states, we had 9 out of 13 states to ratify the Constitution for the Constitution to officially go into effect. However, New York was slow to ratify. As we talked about, they had to have New York in order to have any type of commerce going on in the colonies. So the goal of developing the Bill of Rights and writing the Federalist Papers was to convince the citizens of New York and anti-federalists to support the new Constitution. The work we currently do as public administrators is directly affected by the liberties and freedoms incorporated into the Bill of Rights. So question 1A, select 3 freedoms discussed in the Bill of Rights and discuss how these freedoms affect the work of public administrators. Now, the 3 freedoms that you select, they don't have to all be from different amendments. As we know, the First Amendment, you've got 4 freedoms built into the First Amendment right off the bat. So if you want to use 3 of those freedoms from the First Amendment, that's fine. If you do want to use 3 different amendments and freedoms found in 3 different amendments, that's fine as well. But I'm looking for you to select 3 freedoms that are listed in the Bill of Rights and then discuss how those freedoms affect our work as public administrators. Again, about a paragraph in response should be good enough. Then in question 1B, Madison made a compelling argument for the new Constitution in Federalist Paper 39. Select and discuss 3 arguments made by Madison in Federalist 39 to convince anti-federalists to support the new Constitution. You know, I'm a big fan of Madison's writing, and I really like the argument he made in Federalist 39. We went through it very briefly in class a couple of weeks ago. You have access to Federalist 39, so reread Federalist 39 in the wake of what we discussed a couple of weeks ago, and then identify 3 of the arguments and discuss 3 of the arguments that Madison makes in Federalist 39 to support this new Constitution and convince the anti-federalists to support it. Again, about a paragraph should be enough to get the job done for 1B as well. So that's scenario 1 and the 2 questions related to scenario 1. Not that it's really a scenario, but we're going to call the scenario for our purposes. Now, scenario 2 really is a scenario. So in scenario 2, the city of South Terra Verde is a quickly growing community adjacent to a large metropolitan area. South Terra Verde has decided to construct a large public park in the center of town to accommodate the recreation needs of its growing population. The City Council has been discussing this issue for the past 2 months and plans to discuss the purchase of land for this park again at their next council meeting, with a possible vote on the purchase also scheduled for this meeting. Councilmember Hayes recently, as of last week, purchased a tract of land within the area for the proposed city park. Councilmember Hayes plans to participate in the discussion and vote on the city's purchase of the land for the park. Question 2A, if Mr. Hayes participates in the discussion and votes on the proposed land purchase, which principles in the ASPA Code of Ethics would this potentially violate and why? So tell me which of those 8 principles in the ASPA Code of Ethics that this action would violate, and then give me a little brief justification for why that is a principle that would be violated by Mr. Hayes's action. And then question 2B, a more general question from your perspective. Are you concerned about Mr. Hayes's purchase of the land? Why or why not? So that's a much more general, your personal reflection on the scenario. So that is our accountability and ethics scenario for the assessment. Then scenario number 3 gets at the information we're going to cover tonight in terms of the salient differences between public and private sectors and public and private service and organizations. The Midtown Unified School District has seen its student population increase by 40% over the past 2 years. The growth is forecast to continue for the next 10 years due to development within the city's jurisdiction. within the district's jurisdiction, I'm sorry. Faced with this exponential growth in student population, the district needs to construct new schools quickly. The district decided to construct a school on the east side of the city by funding this school construction with bonds, which means borrowing money. The construction costs for this school are estimated to be $65 million, and that's kind of a low ball estimate. I know in my district, when we built a school 12 years ago, that school cost 55 million, and that was 12 years ago. And with escalating costs, um, probably that 65 million is kind of a low ball figure, but construction costs for the school are estimated to be $65 million, and construction should take 18 months. The district also entered into an agreement with the developer to construct another school on the western edge of the city. So the district needs two schools. The one on the eastern edge is going to be done more traditionally, financed through bonds issued by the school district. Then the one on the western edge of the city will be completely built by the developer with little to no district interaction. The school will be identical to the school to the east and is estimated to cost $45 million and to take 12 months to complete. So assume that the plans for the two schools are completely the same. So they're identical plans for the schools. It's just the one on the west side of the city of the jurisdiction will cost $45 million as opposed to $65 million and will be completed in 12 months as opposed to 18 months. So question 3A, what explains the discrepancy in the time to completion and the cost between the two schools? And then 3B, what are some of the disadvantages to allowing a private sector developer to construct the school on the west side of the city? So this is our public-private differences scenario. So once we are done with class tonight, you definitely have the information you need to answer scenarios 1, 2, and 3. Then scenario 4 gets into our discussion of public administration as a field of study or a discipline. And depending on how much time we have available at the end of class tonight, we may get into this material tonight. If not, then it'll be the first thing that we'll cover next week. As we know, Woodrow Wilson's classic article, The Study of Administration, formed the basis for a separate field of study of administration. One of the enduring concepts that emerged from the article was the idea of a politics-administration dichotomy. We'll be reading the Woodrow Wilson article, and we'll know that if you have taken an undergraduate public administration class, you already know this. If not, then the politics-administration dichotomy is the primary theory that came out of Woodrow Wilson's seminal article. Question 4A, describe Wilson's argument for why we need a separate study of public administration. And then 4B, describe the politics administration dichotomy and why this dichotomy is no longer as valid as it once may have been. So again, we may get into some of the information tonight. If time does not afford us, then we'll wait until next week. And then scenario number 5. The Department of Housing in the city of Tyler Heights is a large, old organization in the state of New Mexico. Its primary function is to make adequate and affordable housing available to income-eligible residents in the city. As an older organization, the Department of Housing has developed an extensive set of policies and procedures. Employees are held accountable and evaluated based upon how closely they adhere to these policies and procedures. Employee turnover is high as employees feel that they are not valued and have few opportunities to develop their skills through training. There is little vertical and horizontal communication occurring in the organization. So these are some of the dysfunctional aspects of this organization, the Department of Housing in the city of Tyler Heights. Question 5A, select 2 classical organization theorists or theories that you feel would benefit the organization. Describe these theories and why they would benefit the organization. Then in 5B, select 2 neoclassical organizational theorists or theories that you feel would benefit the organization and discuss why they would be beneficial. So this information draws upon our discussion of the theoretical assumptions or perspectives on public administration. This is information that we will cover in class next week. So by the end of class next week, You'll have all the information that you need to answer scenarios 4 and 5, and you'll then be able to complete the midterm assessment. Again, this midterm assessment is due by 11:59 and 59 seconds p.m. on February the 11th. My recommendation is I have this up in a Word file on our Canvas site. Just download the file and type your answers directly into this file. I think that's the easiest and the most well-organized way to do it. So just, download it, and then once you're answering question 1A, below question 1A, just type in your answer. It's oftentimes good for you as well as for me if maybe you put your answer in a different color font than what's on the midterm assessment. Just kind of make your answers stand out a little bit from the question. But just go ahead and type your answers directly onto this file, save the file, and then you can upload it at the assignment link on our Canvas site. So that is the midterm assessment, the 5 scenarios, as well as the 10 questions on the assessment. So hopefully it's all clear. Any questions just from our initial discussion of the assessment? As you are working on this assessment, questions will probably emerge. As they emerge, just send me an email and I will respond to your email very quickly, and I will be happy to provide any answers I can to any ambiguities that you have in terms of the assignment. Cecilia, go ahead.
Hi, Professor. So I had a quick question. So based on the reading that we did for the discussions, we can do this assessment too, right?
Yeah, the readings that you're doing for the discussion board for the Canvas essays, yeah, it's the same readings that you'll be using then for answering these scenarios. Right.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you.
Sure. Any other questions or any clarifications? Okay. As I told you, PPA 500 is a little bit of a different kind of animal in the NPA program in that we are not a research-based class. We are an introductory course. And so our whole goal is just to get you ready to succeed in the NPA program, introduce the field of public administration to you as a field of study. And so this is not a research assignment. This is truly just an assessment of what you have learned and how well you can apply this information to the somewhat, hopefully, practical public administration scenarios. I've told you before, I get up on my soapbox and tell you that an MPA program is both an academic as well as a professional program. And as a professional program, we really need to understand that nexus between theories, concepts, and then practice in the quote unquote real world of public administration. And hopefully, an assessment like this gets us a little closer to that nexus. Okay, very good. Having done that, let's go ahead and jump into our material for tonight. And again, this information, if you've done public administration before, if you've been working in the public sector for a while, some of this information will be very, very familiar to you. If you're new to the study of public administration, this is a good way to kind of get acclimated to the uniqueness of studying public organizations as compared to studying organizations in the private sector. So, public administration as a topic is literally immense in that we encounter public administration on a daily basis in pretty much everything that we do. So we know that we encounter government bureaucracies everywhere. Rules and regulations, laws surround us. Whether it's, regulations in terms of the safety of the cars that we drive, the roads that we drive on, the medications that we take, the food we eat, the air that we breathe, our work conditions. All those things are touched in one way or another by public administration and public policy. Since public administration is so pervasive in our lives, people are obviously very concerned about it. And bureaucracy, since it touches everyone's life, it really becomes very much the source of a whole lot of debate. Our goal in public administration is obviously to implement programs in the most efficient and effective way possible, while, as we talked about last week, still being held accountable to elected officials and to the voters. So we have to balance our efficiency and our effectiveness with these demands for accountability. So when we study public administration, what specifically are we studying? Public administration at its very heart is the study of public bureaucracies. Well, that's all well and good. But then that begs the question of, well, what is a public bureaucracy? Public bureaucracy clearly refers to public organizations. Ergo, the study of public administration is centered around the study of public organizations. You have one course in your core curriculum that looks specifically at public organizations, PPA 660. The work that you will do in budgeting and finance, all of that work in budgeting and finance occurs within public organizations, within these public bureaucracies. The human resources that we are managing, those human resources are employed within those bureaucratic organizations. Policies and programs are also implemented and administered through those public organizations. So it's very hard. Public administration is the study of public bureaucracies. Public bureaucracies refer to public organizations. So let's define public organizations. What is a public organization? A public organization is a formal, rational system of relationships among persons vested with administrative authority to carry out public programs. So that's a nice definition, but let's go and deconstruct it and break it down into its component elements. So public organizations are, first off, formal. If you work in the public sector, you see that in your organization on a daily basis. We have formal organizations. We adhere to rules and regulations and policies and procedures. We have formal organization charts that we adhere to. We probably have position descriptions that describe what we do on a daily basis, which are formal. Oftentimes we have to sign those descriptions, indicating that we know what our jobs are. We have performance evaluation processes that are formal, again, not just formality in terms of being dictated by the organization, but also oftentimes those evaluation processes are also dictated by public employee unions. So we are formal. We are also rational in nature. And when we talk about the theoretical perspectives on public administration, we will start our discussion with Max Weber and his idea or formality in organizations, of rationality in organizations. So Max Weber, as we'll see next week, was a big believer that public, or really just organizations, bureaucracies themselves, are the highest point of rationality possible. And so in our organizations, we make rational decisions. What is a rational decision? So if we're going to make a decision in a rational manner, what does that process look like? How do we make rational decisions? Any ideas? What makes something rational in nature?
Something that you think out before you act on?
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. Something that is thought out, something that is planned out before actions are taken. Something, as Alexandra says, has some justification to it. We can base it on something. Rules to follow, as Monica says. Yeah, those are all aspects of rationality. When we make rational decisions, we are going to take into account all the information out there, all the information that we can possibly obtain, and we're going to utilize that information in order to render a decision. So we're not going to make a decision just based upon what we feel. We're going to make a decision based upon empirical evidence. So in a rational system, we obtain empirical evidence, we analyze that empirical evidence, and then we use that analysis to inform our decisions. So that is what we do in these formal bureaucratic organizations. So we are formal, we're rational, and it's a formal, rational system of relationships among persons in the organization. So we're looking at how people relate with each other, how people relate with their organization, how the organization relates with employees, how administrators relate with people outside the organization in terms of how they interact with members of the public, their beneficiaries they are supposed to serve. So we're looking at relationships that are formal and rational. And we're looking at administrators. These people are administrators who are vested with administrative authority. They're vested with administrative authority because their positions are positions that are within organizations that have been created through enabling legislation. So our public organizations have been created typically by a legislative body through enabling legislation. That means that these public organizations have the force of law, they have the force of government authority behind them. So these are people, these administrators who have that type of authority vested in them, and their job then is to carry out these public programs. So this definition, I think, is a pretty good definition of what we consider to be a public organization. So a public organization is a public bureaucracy. A public administrator working in one of those public bureaucracies, we refer to as being a bureaucrat. The contention among many members of the public is that the bureaucracy is held in relatively low regard. And if you say the word bureaucracy to a member of the public, they are going to return to you with words such as inefficient or corrupt or red tape or impersonal, non-responsive. Most of the words that they associate with bureaucracy are going to be very negative words. And Charles Goodsell again told us that back in his 1970 book, The Case for the Bureaucracy. So the contention among members of the public is that bureaucracy writ large is too inefficient to accomplish much of anything, but at the same time, it's made up of all too efficient users and abusers of power. So they'll make the argument that bureaucracies are inefficient and don't really have the ability to do much of anything, while at the same time, those people who populate those organizations actually have too much power and abuse their power too much. So it's kind of this hypocritical type of view of the bureaucracy. The bureaucracy is weak and inefficient, but the members of the bureaucracy are actually too powerful. So that's that negative opinion that people tend to have in regards to the bureaucracy. What Charles Goodsell told us back in his 1970 book is that it's important for public administrators to try and counter those negative perceptions by trying to advocate for the bureaucracy and advocate for the importance of public service and the work that we are trying to do. Yeah, as April said, yeah, you can certainly see a lot of this type of hypocrisy in a lot of the public political discourse that's going on today. So one of the upshots of this, if you will, is that as we are working in public organizations, sometimes it's difficult for public administrators to be highly motivated when they are continuously hearing from the public just how horrible working in the public sector is. And so sometimes that will have this disincentive type of impact upon the motivation of public administrators. And we'll talk more about that a little bit later on as we go through this information tonight. So we are here to study public administration, which is a study of public bureaucracies, which is essentially the study of public organizations. The problem for public administration is that public administration for many years has suffered from a crisis of identity. And that crisis of identity has revolved around our struggle to show how and why we are distinct from private administration. There are thousands upon thousands of MBA programs around the world. There are a little bit over about 170 NASPA accredited MPA programs around the world. So there are a whole lot more MBA programs than there are MPA programs. Oftentimes, when someone gains admission to an MPA program, they tell their friends and family, I'm getting an MPA. They mishear them as saying, I'm getting an MBA. So we really have tried for many years to really distinguish why the MPA is different from the MBA. PPA. And I think two main reasons why we have seen this difference, and we can really justify this difference between the two sectors. In the public sector, we have this role of public authority. As we said, our organizations, our programs, those are created by legislative organizations. They are created by governments. So that gives us a public authority that you don't necessarily see in a private corporation. Private corporation can be started by individuals. One entrepreneur can start a private corporation if they so choose. So it's not the same role of public authority in the private as it is in the public sector. And another big distinction that we oftentimes fall back on are these characteristic organizational processes that are so different here in the public sector as compared to in the private sector. And this is something we'll talk a lot about, especially as we talk about the Graham Allison article, some of the major characteristic organizational processes that are really truly different in the public sector. Now, a similarity between the public and private sector is that both public and private sector organizations contribute to policy execution. So, policy formulation is putting the policy together. Policy execution is actually going out there and implementing that policy. Both public and private sector organizations contribute to policy execution. When you take the policy class, and even when we talk about policy in a few weeks in this class, a couple of weeks, we'll talk about different types of policies. And here in the US, we typically have three main types of public policies. We have distributive policies, redistributive policies, and regulatory policies. Now, we don't see a whole lot of truly distributive policies. A distributive policy is a policy in which money and resources are given out without hurting anyone else. So you're not redistributing, you're not taking resources from one civic society and giving it to another. These are essentially new resources that can be given out without harming anyone. Not a lot of great examples of distributive policies. The vast majority of our policies in this country are redistributive. We redistribute wealth and resources from one segment of society to another segment of society. The third type of policy is a regulatory policy, where the policy regulates some type of private enterprise or some type of private behavior. When you have those regulatory policies, the success of those regulations will be dependent upon the participation on the part of those who are being regulated, meaning the private sector. So the private sector is going to be very involved in the success of the policy execution, especially for regulatory types of policies. The difference between public and private sector is that whereas the public sector is engaged in both the formulation and the execution of policy, the private sector is most directly involved in execution. So there's less of a role in policy formulation for the private sector as compared to the public sector. Now, we'll talk about some exceptions to that in a couple of minutes. We'll talk about lobbying and campaign contributions from PACs and how they, at least indirectly, can be involved. The private sector can try and get involved in policy formulation, but the involvement is much more direct on the part of the public sector. And in the public sector, we emphasize administrative responsibility because, again, we are managing public taxpayer dollars and resources. So it's kind of at the 30,000 foot level. Those are just kind of some of the ways in which we can distinguish the public sector from the private sector. But we'll drill into some of those distinctions a little bit later on. One important piece of legislation that does help us distinguish between public and private sectors is this thing known as the Federal Anti-Deficiency Act. It, in the past, was kind of seen as being an arcane piece of legislation that has really become prominent in the last few years. And you may have heard a lot of talk about it in the media. The Federal Anti-Deficiency Act forbids government officials from spending on anything that is not explicitly authorized by law. So the Anti-Deficiency Act says if we are going to spend resources on this, it must be actually authorized within law. We cannot spend money on something that's not authorized by law. However, Private organizations have the ability to spend on pretty much anything that they want as long as that spending is not forbidden by law. So we can only spend on what is authorized by law. Private sector can spend on anything they want as long as it's not forbidden by law. So we have much narrower guardrails that we have to stay within as we are doing our jobs as public administrators. This Anti-Deficiency Act has really been put to the test. It was put to the test in the first Trump administration. We had a government shutdown. And that government shutdown that then bled into, I think it was January of 2018, I want to say, really tested this Anti-Deficiency Act. If you remember back then, what had happened is that we had had a big piece of legislation to overhaul the income tax system, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017. Under the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, we had a big overhaul to the federal income tax code and a lot of new stipulations that were added to federal income tax law. And so, for instance, it got rid of exemptions. So you can no longer claim exemptions on your taxes. It increased the standard deduction up to almost doubled the standard deduction over a few years to try and get more people to file streamlined tax returns. So they wouldn't be itemizing, they would just claim the standard deduction. It changed the rules in terms of the state and local tax deduction and reduced it down to $10,000 as the maximum deduction you could claim, what's called the SALT deduction. So it made all these changes, a lot of additional changes to our tax law. Then along comes the government shutdown. And in January 2018, we have this partial government shutdown. One of the departments that was hit by this shutdown was the Department of Treasury. Well, what's located within the Department of Treasury? The Internal Revenue Service. So come January, people start filling out their taxes. Well, at the IRS was on a skeleton crew because it was partly shut down. So they didn't have their normal customer service up and running. And so people were not able to contact the IRS in order to file their taxes. So there's a whole lot of backlash against the administration for that. So the Trump administration wanted to bring all these IRS agents back to work and to pay them to start manning these phones and providing this customer service. Problem with that is that would have been a violation of the Anti-Deficiency Act because as long as there's not an appropriation bill to cover the Department of Treasury and the IRS, there is no authorization for paying the salaries of these IRS employees. So we saw the Trump administration run into the Anti-Deficiency Act there in 2018. In the current manifestation of the Trump administration, we are having discussions about the Anti-Deficiency Act again, as the administration is trying to reorient money that was authorized for certain purposes and then spend that money on different purposes. Technically, under the Anti-Deficiency Act, you cannot do that. You can only spend money on everything that is explicitly authorized by law and nothing else. So I think that the Anti-Deficiency Act is a really good way to kind of distinguish between the limitations we have on spending money in the public sector versus the lack of those types of restrictions in the private sector. And it'll be interesting to see this Anti-Deficiency Act as we see the Trump administration engage in more and more rescissions without Congress pushing back on those rescissions. Whenever those rescissions happen and the Trump administration decides they're not spending money on this type of purpose that was authorized by law, but they want to spend it somewhere else, then I think you'll see members of Congress raising questions about the Anti-Deficiency Act. But let's delve deeper into this discussion of the primary differences and similarities between public and private sector organizations. And one of the classics articles you have for tonight was the Graham Allison article, Public and Private Organizations, Are They Alike in All Unimportant Respects? And I think Allison, in that title of his article, kind of spells out exactly his conclusion and the conclusion that he arrives at. But hopefully you had a chance to read the Graham Allison article. It's one of my favorite articles. Tell me about the Graham Allison article. What's the argument that Graham Allison makes in that article about public versus private sectors? And he makes a few arguments in the article, but just kind of crystallize those arguments into what do you think is the major point of the Allison article? And I'm not that concerned about the beginning of the article where he talks about, it gives you examples of different types of positions. But see, Monica says public organizations have to consider a lot more than private organizations. Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the arguments that he makes is that there are really a lot more moving parts in the public sector, especially in terms of how we do our jobs. I think it's interesting that Allison in the article points out here are similarities between public and private sectors, and then here are differences. And yeah, exactly, Brendan, there are differences in ownership, who owns a public organization versus who owns a private organization. In the public sector, our public organizations are more a polyarchy as opposed to being market driven as they are in the private sector. They're not necessarily the decision maker compared to a CEO of a company. Absolutely. There are a lot more limitations on what a leader or manager in a public organization can do as compared to what the CEO of a company can do. One of those main differences, as Allison tells us, is in terms of the career civil service that whenever you have public employees who are members of a career civil service and oftentimes members of a public sector employee union, there are limitations that are set up in terms of how you can manage those employees. You have to match those employees in accordance with their civil service protections, as well as manage them in accordance with the stipulations in the collective bargaining agreement. In the private sector, those employees are at-will employees. Since they are at-will employees, they don't have career civil service protections. They serve at the pleasure of the organization, at the pleasure of the CEO, and absent discrimination, they can be fired for pretty much any reason the organization wants to fire them for. So that's a major difference, the lack of control we have in the public sector compared to the amount of control in the private sector. As Kyle says, public managers have to answer to politics, laws, public, etc., in ways private managers do not. We have many masters in the public sector. And yes, we have to be held accountable to all of these laws and regulations. We also have to be held accountable politically by these elected officials. Private managers don't have the same political environment that they have to contend with. So essentially, what Allison is telling us, yeah, the end goal and what performance is a major difference as well. And we'll talk about performance measures and how it's so much easier oftentimes to measure performance, both organizational as well as employee performance in a private organization as compared to measuring those in a public organization. So Allison tells us there are similarities and there are differences. His question is, are those similarities important enough to be concerned about? Or is it really the differences that are most important? So the similarities between public and private sector organizations will revolve around the basic functions of those organizations. Essentially, what Allison tells us is public and private organizations are similar in terms of the what they do. So the types of functions, what they're doing on a daily basis is going to be similar. Yeah, and you're right. And Lorraine has a really good point about safeguards in public organizations often appear as inefficiencies. And yeah, because with those safeguards, you have redundancies that are built into the process. Those redundancies are oftentimes viewed as the public as being very inefficient in nature. I always use an example when I taught undergraduate intro to public administration. This was many, many years before Donald Trump became president. But I use the example of Donald Trump and the ice rink in Central Park. It's a classic public administration case where the city of New York was trying to redo and renovate the ice rink in Central Park. It was running over budget. It simply wasn't getting done on time. And so Donald Trump stepped in and said, well, let me do it and I'll get it done. And sure enough, when he stepped in, it did get done and was brought in a lot sooner than it would have been if the city was doing it. But the reason for that was because there weren't as many limitations on what Trump could do as compared to what the city of New York had to abide by. There are a lot of those safeguards built in terms of competitive bidding, vetting of contractors and subcontractors on the public side that the Trump organization didn't have to worry, or Trump Corporation didn't have to worry about doing. But the what we do in public versus private organizations is similar in that our functions are going to be similar. Regardless of whether you're a public or a private sector manager, you are going to engage in the function of planning. You're going to engage in strategic planning, developing mission and developing goals, a strategic plan. We do that in the public sector. We do it also in the private sector. So the planning function is something that's done by both sectors. How we do planning is much different, but we both do planning. The second function that we both do in both sectors is organization. Now, if I can type and talk at the same time. Organization. I'm almost there. Organization. We have to organize the people within our organizations. We have to organize the resources that we are managing. So we both engage in organization. We both have to staff our organizations, and that's not staffing. That's staffing. We have to staff organizations. We have to hire people. How we hire people is going to be different, but we have to staff organizations, whether it's in the public or in the private sector. As leaders and managers, we engage in directing. We have to direct the functions of people within our organizations in terms of what they are doing on a daily basis. We have to coordinate work to make sure that everyone in our organization is working toward achieving the same goals and objectives. And we engage in reporting in that in order to know whether we're achieving our goals, we have to have a reporting system in place. And so we'll do our annual reports or our semi-annual reports or our monthly reports, however we do it. We have to engage in the reporting function. And money is the lifeblood of any organization, so we have to engage in the function of budgeting. So we all do planning, organizing, staffing, directing, coordinating, reporting, and budgeting. These are the basic management functions that occur in both the public and private sector. So that is how we are similar. However, how we do those things will certainly be a lot different in the public sector as compared to in the private sector. So he kind of walks us through some of those differences in how we do these processes between public and private organizations. And this should all be pretty common and familiar to us who work in the public sector. So in terms of staffing, we, as we said before, have a career civil service system in the public sector as compared to at-will employment in the private sector. That not only affects how we manage people on the job, it also affects how we bring people into the organization. If you are working in a public organization and when you went through your hiring process, it was probably a very protracted, very long and gradual type of process. Whenever we hire a new faculty member here in Cal State, is we will put that advertisement out for the first time usually in late July. And then we don't actually extend an offer to a candidate until usually late February or early March. And that's 6 months is not an unusual timeline for hiring people to work in public organizations. And we'll talk about all the specific things we go through in hiring as we talk about the management of human resources in a couple of weeks. But we know that we are very concerned about creating a representative bureaucracy. We know we have to engage in targeted recruitment. We know we have to have vetting of those applicant pools. And so it takes us a lot longer. In the private sector, you're dealing with at-will employees. You could interview someone and hire them on the exact same day. If payroll can get their stuff together in time, then they can actually start the same day in which they are hired. So it's a completely different way in which we do the staffing function. Also, as I said before, when we're dealing with staffing, many of our employees in the public sector are members of public employee unions, which means that they are going to have a collective bargaining process and they will have a collective bargaining agreement. So we as managers not only need to be well versed in career civil service, we also need to be well versed in the stipulations in the collective bargaining agreement as well. That is why a lot of organizations have centralized the human resource management process in an Office of Human Resources. Kind of let the professionals deal with a lot of these different stipulations and take it out of the hands of our line managers. Now, this whole thing about career civil service, There's a big caveat that we have to add to that. And that caveat is what has happened over the past year in the federal bureaucracy. We know that the federal bureaucracy has been downsized to the tune of about 234,000 positions. A lot of those positions were probationary positions. And as probationary positions, those employees could be terminated while they were on probation in a pretty easy and seamless type of process. However, some of those other employees were career civil servants. And so some of these civil service protections that we have become so familiar with in public administration, those are certainly being challenged over the past year. We have a lot of cases working their way through the court in terms of testing how much power the White House has in terminating a career civil service employee without regard to their civil service protections. And so this could be changing. But historically in public administration, we have this career civil service system. As was mentioned before in text chat, performance measurement. We measure performance in both sectors. How we do it in the public sector is obviously a whole lot different. It's more difficult for us to measure the performance of public organizations when our outputs and outcomes are less quantitative. So in the private sector, you have a widget factory, as economists like to talk about, and that widget factory is in business to produce the highest quality, low-cost widgets that they can possibly produce. Those widgets are relatively easy to measure. You can measure the quality of those widgets, usually using quantitative measurements. Enhancing the quality of life of a beneficiary in the public sector lacks those quantitative elements, and so it's much more difficult to measure the performance of the organization. Likewise, it's more difficult then for us to measure the performance of individual employees in their ability to achieve these outputs and these outcomes. Competing standards. Since we serve many masters, we have a lot of different standards that are being imposed upon us by executive, legislative, and judicial branches, by national, state, and local government. So we contend with a lot more of those competing standards. That's another major difference in terms of how we do our work on a daily basis. Clearly, public scrutiny is a major difference. We have the fishbowl effect. And so especially in a state like California, where we have all of these transparency laws, we have to abide by all those laws in order to maintain public scrutiny and to allow the public to participate in our decision-making processes. Not so in the private sector. We do audits. We have to open our books up. We have to, whenever we would approve audits, we'd have to approve those audits in an open meeting with public comment. That's something you won't see many private corporations do. Because of all these limitations in carrying out these functions, public managers rely much more on persuasion as opposed to direction. And so when you cannot direct someone to do something, you need to persuade them. And we'll see as we go through the theoretical perspectives on public administration, a lot of our schools of thought are predicated upon this idea of how managers can persuade their employees in order to lead to higher levels of efficiency and effectiveness. So persuasion is really a talent, and it's really a skill that public managers need to have and to try and learn how to do. In the world of political science, there's a very famous political scientist, Richard Neustadt, who talked about the power of the presidency as being power of persuasion, in that presidents don't have the ability to just tell someone to do something, they need to persuade them. And Martin's got a good question in text chat. What are some examples of persuasion? One great example of persuasion that we'll talk about next week when we talk about theoretical perspectives comes from Chester Barnard. And Chester Barnard makes the argument that successful and effective managers, their success is dependent upon the compliance and acquiescence of their employees. And so he argues managers engage in a transactional relationship with their employees. And that transactional relationship is that managers will provide incentives. So they may provide incentives such as you'll be employee of the week if you get this project done by Monday morning. Or we'll give you more flexibility in terms of your assignments. Or maybe we can offer you flex time, 440 type of schedule. And those are all incentives that a manager can provide to an employee to try and induce that employee and persuade that employee to put forth the amount of effort necessary to get the job done. So it really becomes much more of that persuasive transactional type of relationship in the public sector as compared to in the private sector, where a manager may be able to say, you do this or you're fired. You can't really do that so often in the public sector. You can say if you don't do this, it will factor into your next performance evaluation. But then you have to provide that person training and development opportunities to try and remedy those subpar performance evaluation marks, and then reevaluate them again. And since they're career civil servants, it takes you a while to go through that disciplinary process. And so providing those incentives, that's an example of persuasion. From a presidential perspective, we've seen presidents like Lyndon Baines Johnson, who had great persuasive powers, where he would use his stature, his literal physical stature, to kind of lord over members of Congress in order to get them to do what he wanted them to do. And obviously, oversight. We are subject to a lot of oversight here in public organizations. We talked about that last week when we talked about the principal-agent relationship and some of the problems with oversight. But we are much more subject to oversight in the public sector as compared to a private sector organization. So I think Allison's argument that the functions are similar, but how we do those functions, that is what is the major difference between public and private organizations. I think that is a very important type of argument. And I think Allison's argument then provides us with justification for showing the different nature of studying public administration as compared to studying private organizations. Now, I think if we would talk to the vast majority of people who run MBA programs and the vast majority of people who run MPA programs, I think the vast majority will say, yes, there are differences significant enough to warrant both of those programs existing. I'll also point out to you, MPA programs tend to be a lot cheaper than MBA programs. This program is a total cost of under $20,000. It's going to be hard pressed for you to find an MBA program that's going to be under $20,000. I believe the one here at Cal State Long Beach, the online MBA program, I think is $40,000 or $45,000, and so they do tend to be more expensive. But I think anyone in either one of those programs will agree that there are substantial, significant differences. One caveat I'll add to that, though, is there is one MPA program that is accredited by NASPA that has joined forces with an MBA program. And I won't identify the university, but it's here in the West, it's in the Northwest. And they actually have a program that is a joint MBA MPA program. So much so that at the capstone project, at the end of the year for students in the program will rotate between being a business project versus a public administration project. So one year it will focus on a private corporation, the next year it will focus on a public or nonprofit organization. But that is the exception to the rule. So I think that we do have a good justification for a separate study of public administration. The one thing we haven't talked about yet is this idea of the profit motive. And usually when you ask someone, what's the difference between public and private organizations? The first thing they will say is profit. Private organizations are in the business to make a profit. They have a bottom line that they have to adhere to. Most public organizations do not. And so they don't have that profit motive. I think that is obviously true. And I think it is a necessary but not yet sufficient difference between the two sectors. And the reason for that is that there are private non-governmental organizations that don't have a profit motive. Those are nonprofit organizations. So nonprofit organizations are private, they are non-governmental, but they also don't run a profit. Likewise, you can have some government organizations that do run a profit in that they are created by government and they are considered to be quasi-public organizations, but they are in existence to run a profit. An example of that would be a government corporation. So the United States Postal Service is an example of a government corporation. It was created by Congress. It's one of Congress's Article 1, Section 8 powers to make post offices. So it was established by Congress. It does return to Congress for its funding every year, but it is, in theory, supposed to run a profit. Now, it doesn't run a profit and hasn't been profitable for quite some time, but at least in its charter is supposed to run a profit as a government corporation. So that's an example of a governmental organization that actually runs a profit. So this distinction on profit motive, I think, is important, but it's not sufficient for justifying the differences between public and private organizations. Another way in which we can look at the differences between public and private organizations is in terms of the types of goods and services that they produce. So if you've had some type of a public sector economics course in the past, you've probably talked about different types of goods, whether they be public goods, private goods, toll goods, or common pool goods. But let's walk through those four different types of goods that can be created by an organization and kind of distinguish between them. So we'll start with public goods. A pure public good is a good that is non-exhaustible, so it cannot be used up, and it's also non-excludable in that you cannot exclude people from partaking in the benefits of that good. So first off, it's non-exhaustible, meaning that if I use a pure public good, it doesn't exhaust it for you. You and I are not rivals for that pure public good. I can use and get as much benefit from a pure public good as I want, and that doesn't reduce the amount of benefit you get from that pure public good. We oftentimes like to think about national defense as being a pure public good. Now, admittedly, the components we use in national defense are oftentimes privatized. They oftentimes come from contracts with private sector contractors like Boeing and Northrop Grumman and all the other private contractors. But the actual national defense itself is usually considered to be a pure public good. Martin asked the question, can I answer finite goods exist in public goods? I want to see if food is one, but does it have scarcity in certain countries? Food is an interesting one because it is limited in that it can be used up. It can be seen a little bit more as being what we consider to be a common pool good, in that it's something that should be available to everyone. So you shouldn't really be able to exclude people from it, but it can be exhausted and can be used up. So I think if you're looking at food in that perspective, I think you're looking at more kind of as a common pool as compared to a pure public good. Because, food, especially in this country, food is charged for. Now, certainly we have some commodity exemptions that we include with food so that we can reduce the cost of food to try and make it available to all. We have food pantries, we have social welfare programs to make food more available to those who don't have the financial wherewithal to pay for it. But, overall, you still pay a cost and you still pay a price for that food. So I think it's a little bit more maybe a collective pool good than a pure public good. But in terms of something like national defense that we consider to be a pure public good, I may get a great deal of satisfaction from from national defense. I may get a great benefit from it. You may not be all that concerned about foreign invasion, and so you don't get quite as much of a benefit, but my benefit I get doesn't erode the benefit that you can get. We also cannot charge people for the benefit they get from having national defense. If I get a great deal of benefit, you're not going to charge me more for the benefit I get as compared to someone who gets less of a benefit. So basically, it's non-exhaustive, it's inexhaustible, and it's also non-excludable in that you can't charge people and then exclude those who do not pay that charge for that pure public good. When we have pure public goods, or even goods that demonstrate a lot of those public good components, we typically look to government for the provision and production of those goods. Now, here's another important distinction. You notice I said provision and or production. Those are different things. Provision is different from production. Provision is giving the resources that make the production of the good possible. So if you're giving the resources to make the production possible, that's called provision. Production is the actual creation of that good or that service. So if you think about it in terms of the DLMPA program, the provision of that program, those resources come from the fee dollars that you pay for the program or your employer pays for the program. That's the provision, giving the resources. The production is essentially what we are doing here tonight, the actual education itself. So with pure public goods, we usually anticipate that governments will be involved in both provision as well as production. On the opposite side of the spectrum, from a pure public good, you have a pure private good. Pure private good will be exhaustible as well as excludable. So for a pure private good, if I consume it, then it is gone for you to consume. So you think about a really simple example like a candy bar in a convenience store. If there's one candy bar on the shelf and you get there before me because you are younger and more spry than I am, then you get that candy bar, you eat that candy bar, it's now gone and I cannot get a benefit from it. It has been exhausted. You and I were rivals for that pure private good. Also is excludable that if you don't pay for that candy bar, absent stealing it, you don't get to consume that candy bar. So we can exclude people for not paying. That's a chargeability type of mechanism. So a pure private good will have that ability to charge people for the benefits that they are getting from consuming that good. Those pure private goods, we typically leave to the private sector for provision and production, with an exception there. And the exception there is if it is a good that we have deemed that is necessary, a staple type of good, then again, we might be able to step in there with certain types of programs and subsidies to make it possible for people to have the money to then go and purchase those goods so they are not excluded from them. But absent that type of intervention, this is essentially a private sector type of domain. So those are the types of goods that are the opposite ends of the spectrum. So public organizations do public goods, pure public goods. Private organizations do those pure private goods. But then there is a gray area in between. And the two goods that fall in that gray area are toll goods and common pool goods. A toll good is a type of good that is not exhaustible, but it is excludable. So you can exclude people. There is a chargeability mechanism. Basic example is a toll road. You pull up to that bar at the toll road. That bar, if you don't put the money in, the bar doesn't open. You cannot drive on that road. You have been excluded from driving on that road. However, everyone who pays the toll, the bar is going to go up and you're able to drive on that road. Me driving on the road does not exhaust it for you to be able to drive on the road. Once I get out of your way, you're then able to drive on the road as well, as long as you have paid the toll. So it's kind of part public and kind of part private. Then the opposite of a toll good is a common pool good. Common pool goods should be non-excludable, but they are exhaustible. And so natural resources could be an example. That as a society, the society should have access to these natural resources, but once those natural resources are used up, they're exhausted and they are gone for the future. It's the toll goods and the common pool goods where we have a lot of arguments about, is this something that should be done by the public sector or is this something that should be done by the private sector? Obviously, when we get into those toll and those common pool goods, we talk a lot about privatization. So the natural way that we limit public provision and production of goods and services is by privatizing those goods and services. So when we privatize, and a lot of you have worked in this area, and I've seen in some of your posts talking about the competitive bidding and the contracting process, and you've done work in procurement before, so you know how all this works, but we will enter into a contract with a private sector contractor. Government will do the provision because government will pay for the contract, but then the actual production of that good or service, the creation of that good or service will be left to that contractor. So that's where you will have public provision and private sector production. It is also possible to have private sector provision and public sector production. That's a much rarer type of occurrence. An example of that could be, imagine an example where you have a concert promoter, and that concert promoter at their concert, they want to have security. So what they will do is they will contract with the local police department and pay the local police department to come out and actually do security at the concert venue. The contract is being paid for by the concert promoter, a private individual, but the actual production of the security is being done by that local police department. So that would be an example of private provision and public production. So you can have a lot of different arrangements in terms of provision and production depending upon the type of good or service it is. But for our purposes, not to get too much into public finance and budgeting here, you'll talk more about this when you get to 555. But for our purposes here, it's just another way in which we can distinguish between public and private organizations and what they do. Public organizations are mostly involved in pure public goods. Private organizations are more involved in provision and production of pure private goods. But then when we get into privatization, we're dealing with goods that have some public and some private elements. And so we can have kind of that mixture between the two worlds in terms of provision and production. So oftentimes we ask what type of good is being provided and produced in order to determine should this be a public organization's responsibility or should this be the responsibility of a private organization. Then another way that we already foreshadowed earlier that we can distinguish between public and private organizations is in terms of public policies, and specifically the role played by these organizations in the formulation and then execution of these policies. Public and private organizations are both engaged in policy execution, but it's really the unique role of the public organizations to be far more involved in policy formulation. And so I use the terms formulation and formation in a synonymous way, so they're kind of the same thing. So if you see me say formation or formulation, it's the same type of process. So what do public organizations and public administrators do in the course of policy execution versus what do they do in the course of policy formulation? In policy execution, we all know that's the task of public administrators to translate written laws into action. And so the legislature passes these laws. We then, in the administration, then administer these laws. We put these laws into practice through implementation execution. So that is the basic role of public administration. So we have this very strong role in execution. However, in formation, we also have a role to play. Before policies are made, before they are formulated, we have a role as administrators to advise elected officials. So elected officials will ask administrators for advice because it's those administrators who have the knowledge, skills, and abilities and the experience in implementing these types of policies, and they can bring those skills to bear in the design of a public policy. So before the policy is made, our primary job is in terms of advising elected officials. But as we know, even after the policy is made, we have a job in terms of making sense of what that policy means. We know that whenever policies come out of legislative bodies, they tend to do so in very vague formats. If you need to get a majority of members of a legislative body to agree to a public policy, you're probably going to have to keep that policy in a vague format. The more specifics you put in that policy, the more likely you are to turn off and alienate some members of the legislature and get more opposition. So a lot of these policies are passed in very vague, ambiguous form. So it's then left up to the administrators through the administrative rulemaking process to really sort out what these policies really mean and how these policies should then be implemented. So we're engaging not only in policy formulation before the policy is formulated, but we're also engaged in formulation after the policy is formulated as well. We know we have an APA, an Administrative Procedures Act from the 1940s. And the Administrative Procedures Act will dictate how we make rules to then govern the implementation of these policies. Now, again, that's changing. And the past year, we've seen a rulemaking process in a lot of organizations that has been expedited. does not necessarily have the same public comment and public participation that's required under the APA, but at least in theory, you should have public comment. You should have a delay of 60 days between the end of public comment and when this new rule goes into effect, but that's part of policy formulation as well. Well, my favorite question in all of my courses is, so what? So administrators are involved in policy formulation. Well, what difference does that make? There are two impacts of having administrators involved in designing policies. The one potential impact is increased technicality of public policies. That whenever you have these administrators who have this specialized competence, who are involved in the formulation of the policy, those policies tend to become more technical in nature. That if they were just designed alone by elected officials who lack that technical expertise, they'd be less technical. So you have more technical public policies being formulated. And then secondly, when you have administrators involved in policy formulation, you are by definition expanding the power of the chief executive's role in policy making. Because at the end of the day, these administrators are working in public organizations that are part of the executive branch. Who is the head of the executive branch? The chief executive, whether it be a president at the national level or a governor at the state level. So by having these administrators involved in policy formulation, you are by definition expanding the role of the chief executive in the policy formulation process. So it really does matter. It really does make a difference to have public administrators involved in policy formulation. But again, this is all a discussion in terms of showing some of the differences between public and private organizations. What are those major differences? The role played by administrators in formulating policy, which is a role that is not necessarily shared by administrators in private types of organizations. Now, admittedly, the private sector does have some influence on policy formulation. They have that influence through lobbying. And so they create their political action committees. Those political action committees can then donate campaign money to these elected officials. They can lobby these elected officials. So they can have some influence in the formulation process. It's just that the private sector's influence is not nearly as direct and immediate as the influence of public administrators. So it's just one more difference between public and private sectors. So hopefully up to this point in time tonight, what we have done is we have established a justification for the study of public administration as something that is separate and distinct from the study of private organizations. So we're kind of providing that basis for why we have this separate study of public administration. But I think I've talked enough for a while. I've been talking for about an hour and 20 minutes, and I don't think you need to listen to me much longer. So what I thought we would do is do some breakout rooms based upon the information that we have covered up to this point in time. And we'll do a break before this, so we're not going to go directly into this, but just kind of give you a little prelude to it. What we'll do when we come back from our break is I will put you in breakout rooms like we have done before. And what I want each room to do is to consider the idea of privatization. And one of the primary ways to limit government intervention in the economy is privatization. When you limit government intervention in the economy, you are limiting the size and scope of the public sector. Governments, as we know through privatization, enter into contracts with private sector entities to either produce or provide goods and services, typically to produce goods and services. What I'm asking each group to do is select one general policy area that you can come to an agreement on as a group. It could be education, could be policing, could be housing policy, just one very general policy area. And for that policy area, I want the group to discuss the potential for privatization. What aspects of that policy area are amenable to privatization? What are some of the challenges of privatizing in that policy area? Again, the choice of the policy area is up to you as a group. Just come to a consensus and then talk about those two answers to those two questions. What parts of that policy are amenable to privatization, and then what may be challenging in terms of privatizing that policy area. As always, I would ask that each room select a spokesperson. We'll take a break until about 7:30. Then we come back at 7:30. I'll put you into these breakout rooms. We'll spend about 40 or 45 minutes allowing you to work on this in your breakout rooms. We'll then reconvene as a class like we've done before and have the spokesperson from each of our groups then share out what the groups came up with, look for similarities and differences. We'll then reassess where we are in terms of time. If we still have substantial time left, we'll move into a discussion of Woodrow Wilson, the study of public administration. If not, we can hold off on that until next week. So let's go ahead and take a break until 7:30. Come back at 7:30. I'll put you into our groups and we'll do our breakout groups. Okay. All of our rooms are now closed up, so hopefully everyone's back in the main room. So let's see what each room came up with, and we'll start with room number 1.
Sorry, I think that was me. Okay, so we came up with K through 12 education, and we were thinking that one of the aspects that could be privatized would be basically the curriculum and how the curriculum is presented. So basically, some of the programs, it would be like more specialization. So like trades, specific majors, um, for special ed, like it would be its own separate kind of thing where it would be like more focus. And we were thinking that besides that curriculum of being privatized, that we would see maybe corporate sponsorships play a role in possibly not just physically funding for like the buildings or whatever, but also like increase in pay for the employees. So we were thinking that those would be like the positive aspects for privatization of K through 12. And some of the negative things that we came up with were possibly due to the nature that maybe some of the teachers wouldn't be like fully credentialed the way that they are now, that there would be a lack of accessibility. It would be more competitive. There would be a lack of ethics, financial risk to taxpayers, and excuse me, no democracy like in the planning for the public, and a loss of common experiences. So, like for instance, we were all thinking about like in fourth grade here in California, how we do the mission project. Maybe if it was privatized, we wouldn't have the mission project. And then another, well, the last thing I guess would be if we were unsuccessful with the privatization of the curriculum and the programs, that how would we even go back to the way it was prior?
Great. Thank you, April. Those are really thoughtful and very good points. That last point you made, I think, is a really important one. How do you then go back? I think that's something that a lot of, especially in education, a lot of education agencies have had to deal with where they have privatized. We've seen some privatization, different gradations of privatization in education. There's a example in Chelsea, Massachusetts, is a classic example where they actually turned over the operation of their district to a private contractor. And then they decided a few years later they wanted to, I don't know if the word is republicize, but they wanted to go back to public provision and production. and they were still in the middle of their contract. And so it was difficult for them to get out of that. And so I think that's a really important point. Also, those corporate sponsorships, I think that is also a good example of an element of privatization, and especially when that happens with career and technical education. I've seen that in a lot of districts where they have partnered with corporations in providing career technical education programs. I also know in my district, when I was on the board, we had to contract out when we needed professionals who had specific areas of expertise, whether it be speech language pathologists or whatever the case would be. And we didn't have people on staff with those types of skills. And so what we had to do is then contract out. And so that was another opportunity, if you will, for contracting out. I also know that in some states, that public employee unions are so concerned about privatization that they have tried to incorporate anti-privatization movements within their collective bargaining agreement. And some states do not allow that. I know I was years ago when I was in graduate school, I worked on a study for the Advisory Commission on Intergovernmental Relations. And one of the things that we found is that local school districts and unions for local school districts were not allowed to collectively bargain over any aspect of privatization. Even if it was something as simple as privatizing transportation, privatizing bus services, they weren't allowed to make privatization a topic within the permissive scope of collective bargaining. And so it can end up being a very contentious issue. But that's great. Thank you, room one. Thank you, April. Excellent points. Let's go with room number two.
Hi, my name is Marina, and I'll be speaking for group number two. We talked about if Caltrans were to be privatized. So essentially, if the California state highway system were to be privately owned and maintained. We went down a couple rabbit holes talking about toll roads, and it was a fun experiment. But on aspects that would be amenable if the highway system were to be privatized, first, we talked about how there would likely be better efficiency in the maintenance and rehabilitation of the highways. As we know, public processes can be burdensome in terms of time that these processes can take. And so if it were to be privatized, we'd likely see more efficiencies. And then another aspect would be due to the limited access, because in this instance of privatization, we're assuming that the freeway systems would no longer be accessible for free, that there would be tolls charged. And so because of this, we'd assume that there would be less traffic, which would be really great. However, the challenges that we discussed would be potential lack of oversight. So we were kind of asking the question of whether a private highway system would be subject to the same standards in terms of public construction as if they were working with a government agency. I work in the public works department for my city. And, on a local level, we have public works inspectors who work for the city who are responsible for overseeing the operations of our contractors. And so we're wondering if that would be, if there would be a potential lack of oversight there in terms of the quality of infrastructure. And as well as just the pure lack of equitable access to roads, we discussed how, there are a lot of people, especially in the state of California, particularly I work in South Orange County, where a lot of my coworkers who work in the city can't necessarily afford to live in the city. And so they rely on the freeway system to get to work. And so if there were to be tolls charged for that access, there would be likely a lack of equitable access. So thank you.
well done, Rita. And yeah, that issue of equity is an important one. And you're right. I know here at Cal State Long Beach, a lot of faculty do not live in close proximity to the campus just because of housing prices. And so we do have faculty that travel from an hour and a half away, and it would make it difficult for them to get to campus. The maintenance issue is also an important one because if you have a private corporation, their primary incentive is going to be to maximize their profit. And so, if maximizing their profit means cutting corners in terms of maintenance and safety on highways, that's something that might happen more frequently with a private sector organization as compared to with the public. And so, yeah, and this all raises that question of exhaustibility. And whether roads and whether highways are what we consider to be public goods or private goods, I think there is some exhaustibility there in terms of that. Um, if you do have private control and private ownership of these roads, then it's true that you may not have access to them. There's excludability there. That if you're charging tolls for people who use the roads, that you can exclude people who do not pay the tolls to drive on those roads. So you do have some of those private sector issues that could, at least from a theoretical perspective, be included with the issue of highways. But I agree that there are so many complicating factors for a whole-scale privatization that would make it exceedingly difficult. We do know that there's a lot of privatization in terms of specific projects for highway construction and reconstruction, but that seems to kind of be the extent of how far we go in terms of privatization in that respect. So thank you, Marina. Well done. And thank you, room number two. And last but not least, room number three.
Hi, everyone. Room number three also had lots of lively discussion and lots of rabbit holes. But we also were talking about education, just like group one. And we kind of went down two different avenues. So I'll just quickly discuss the ones that were mentioned already and some of the stuff that we thought about on contracting services for schools. And so, some of the discussion was on bus drivers or landscaping services. The landscaping services being that, it could be more efficient, better equipment and that sort of thing. But you do lose the value or the values that people may have working for the school and the culture. And so that can be lost, but also can hurt morale and challenge union type things if you're hiring contracting outside and you still have district employees. And again, with the bus drivers, we understand where it's amenable to when they're hiring bus drivers for field trips that are not employed by the district or the school because they're not paying overtime and they're not paying, benefits and things like that. But again, it challenges those morale type of issues and union type of issues. But another avenue we went down was school of choice, something that is not done here in California, but in lots of other states. And that's where the state provides vouchers to parents and students to choose what school they'd like to go to, whether it's a private school or a public school. So we thought that was really interesting to look at from the public and private perspective and the privatization. And so what some of the amenable aspects are that it breaks down the barriers to procuring advanced technology, furniture, services, and a lot of different things that maybe private schools can do quicker and easier than maybe a public school. However, sometimes the profit and funding aspect can outweigh the quality of the education depending on the school. And so there can be instances where there's less transparency reporting or the requirements that public schools need to adhere to. And so students may not be getting the education that they would at a public school and not being challenged enough. And then when they go from maybe that school to a public school, it's challenging for the educators because they're not up to speed. And so that's where we went with the schools of choice.
Thank you, Lorraine. Thank you, Room number three. And that issue of vouchers, that's a really important one for a lot of states. Like, so we don't really see it here in California, but with vouchers, the question is all about choice and, whether or not families can vote with their feet, use these vouchers, then go to other schools, private schools. The question there is obviously equity. And it would really depend on the size of the voucher. If the voucher would be enough to cover the entire tuition at a private school, then the equity issue is not as important as if it was just partially covered tuition. If you have vouchers that are enough to just partially cover tuition, then obviously it's going to be the more affluent families that are able to make use of those vouchers, as opposed to other families within the public school. And so that's the question of then eroding resources for those public schools to then benefit members of the community who already have resources that other members do not have. So you certainly have those equity types of considerations. You also make a very important point about unions when it comes to privatization. A lot of collective bargaining agreements will have stipulations in them that work that is contracted out cannot be work that is equivalent to work that's already being done by current employees. And so if you want to supplant the work of your employees by hiring landscaping services, that's going to be something that may run afoul of your collective bargaining agreement. And so you'd have to either go in and change that collective bargaining agreement, get a memorandum of understanding or something like that, because they don't want to replace the work of their employees with the work of private sector employees. And so unions really do have a major chilling effect on privatization at all levels and in all governments. Education is a really interesting topic. I'm not surprised that two of the three rooms looked at education just because we have seen so many gradations of privatization in the field of education. Typically, a lot of that privatization has been in terms of transportation, in terms of cafeteria services and food services. But we have seen, as I mentioned before, some districts that have actually completely privatized their entire operations and contracted out with private sector companies such as Edison International. I think another is EAI, Education Alternatives Incorporated, and have really turned over most of their operations directly to a private company. But what we have seen, a lot of those districts that have done that have now gone in the reverse. And they have, once those contracts have expired, they have not renewed those contracts with those corporations. We see a similar thing in terms of criminal justice with prisons. And there's a whole movement toward prison privatization several years ago, where we had states that were turning the entire operations of their prisons over to private companies like CCA, Correction Corporations of America. And we have since seen some of those states, once those contracts expired, then go back to public provision and production. In the Biden administration, we saw rhetoric in the Biden administration to remove all of the private contracts for the federal prison system. That was rhetorical. That actually did not completely happen. And now in the Trump administration, we're seeing a movement toward even more privatization of some of those facilities. And so there are always those political elements that underpin these discussions of privatization. I'm glad it was a useful discussion, and I'm glad that some groups went down rabbit holes. It's very easy to go down those rabbit holes when we're talking about a topic like privatization in a kind of polarizing policy area. And so I'm not surprised that that did happen. And that's good because that then engenders that discussion and it affords you the opportunity to kind of work together a little bit since you'll be working together for the next almost 2 years. At this point in time, the next topic that we usually move to is the discussion of public administration as a discipline and the introduction of Woodrow Wilson and his study of administration. I'm not going to go there right now because I would like to give you the opportunity to read Woodrow Wilson's article if you have not read it yet. And so I'll give you the opportunity to read that article. Then we get together again next Wednesday. We will start with this discussion of Wilson's study of administration. We'll talk about the politics administration dichotomy. We'll talk about the limitations on the politics administration dichotomy, and then how Woodrow Wilson's focus on administration as a separate field of study really provided the impetus for the field of study and the discipline of public administration. We'll then get into a discussion of whether or not public administration truly is a discipline. So another thing, in addition to reading Woodrow Wilson, I would like for you to think about for next week is the idea of what makes something an academic discipline. So we've got a lot of disciplines at the university. We have history and political science and sociology and all these different disciplines. But think about for next week, what makes something an academic discipline? And then we'll ask the question, does public administration fit that definition of a discipline? Does public administration exhibit the characteristics necessary to be a separate academic discipline? So we'll start next week doing that. And then in the second half of class next week, once we have talked about public administration as a discipline, we'll then talk about some of the theoretical perspectives that have been developed for how we study public administration. And I'll walk you through a evolution of the public administration literature beginning in the late 1800s and going up to the modern period of time. And we'll look at how that literature has developed and how our perspectives on the study of public organizations has really changed over the past 150 years. So that our goal is by the end of class next week, you'll then have all the information that you need to handle those 5 scenarios on the midterm assessment that will then be due the following week on February the 11th. Sound good? Any observations or comments or questions about anything we covered tonight or about the midterm assessment or anything at all? Then if not, please do read the Wilson article and think about this idea of what makes an academic discipline. And then we'll get back together again next Wednesday, finish up all the material we'll need then for the midterm assessment. And hope everyone has a good week. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out via email. Otherwise, I'll see you next Wednesday. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great night.
Thank you.